The Great War was a conflict with unprecedented levels of destruction and loss of life, previously unseen in our known history. The combination of advanced technology and old military tactics caused so many casualties on both opposing alliances that both sides started digging in to find protection. After a few months, trench lines were formed between enemies. The deadly deadlock of trench warfare began, and soon some truly terrifying, bizarre yet creative tactics were employed in a desperate effort to break the stalemate and destroy the enemy. Today we are going to talk about how far soldiers went in order to disrupt the enemy and bring victory closer to their countries. Although trenches provided some protection against direct fire and artillery, advancing was practically impossible without enormous casualties. Every traditional charge attack over open no-man's land would end in mowing down thousands of men with machine gun fire and artillery. Daily life in trenches was brutal enough, with constant threats from snipers, bombardments, gas attacks, and the horrors of trenches themselves full of rats, mud, and disease. But this was not enough. To break the monotony, soldiers in trenches came up with various ideas. Some were on a large scale, causing thousands of casualties at once, such as gas attacks and massive shellings, while other tactics required small teams, but their impact was equally terrifying. Let's first talk about trench raiding. This was the most common mission that never gave rest to soldiers in the front trenches during the dark, moonless nights. Trench raiding was a form of surprise attack carried out by small groups of soldiers, aimed to infiltrate enemy trenches, gather intelligence, capture prisoners, and cause chaos and fear. Unlike full-scale assaults, trench raids were swift, targeted, and conducted under the cover of darkness to maximize the element of surprise. Raiding parties were often composed of volunteers, specially trained and battle-hardened. They had special weapons to be effective in close and brutal combat and to quietly eliminate the sentries. Revolvers with silencers, trench knives, and clubs, combined with hand grenades, proved most effective. Soldiers with black-painted faces to blend in the darkness looked terrifying enough, especially when they would just appear from nowhere in your trench. Every soldier in the front trench had this in mind during the night, and the psychological impact of these actions was exceptional. You never knew if a group of trench raiders was approaching to jump into your trench, giving you no chance to call for help, which in any case would not arrive in time. After quietly approaching enemy line under the cover of darkness and eliminating the sentries, they would storm the trenches, causing general chaos and confusion, quickly accomplishing their mission, usually to capture the so-called live tongue, a soldier to be interrogated for intelligence or inflict losses, destroy equipment, and then retreat as safely as possible before enemy reinforcements arrived. Although they sound thrilling, these missions were extremely dangerous and risky, and many trench raiders never returned from them. One wrong step was enough for the party to be discovered and become completely exposed to enemy fire in no man's land. Additionally, after the mission, they had to return safely to their trenches, now that the entire front was aware of their presence. And it often happened that soldiers got separated, disoriented, or lost in no man's land, sometimes even mistaking enemy trenches for their own and jumping into them by mistake. The Germans perfected this technique with their stormtroopers, armed with submachine guns, grenades, and flamethrowers, who caused complete chaos in Allied trenches and were one of the most feared units of the war. The next tactic, born out of the attempt to bring infantry close enough to enemy lines under artillery protection. However, this tactic would cause many casualties from friendly fire. This was called a creeping barrage, a tactic where artillery fire closely followed the advancing infantry, providing cover and moving forward in synchronization. Artillery fire would lay down a curtain of shells just ahead of the advancing troops, moving forward in carefully timed increments. The barrages would advance only about 20 to 40 yards in front of attacking infantry, which was dangerously close, but it meant that they had a relatively short distance to cover once the shelling stopped and they had to hit the enemy trenches. Sounds simple, but in practice it was chaotic and terrifying. The idea was to keep the enemy pinned down and disoriented, preventing them from firing back, organizing a defense, or counterattacking. It required precise coordination between the artillery and infantry, but in a time without reliable radios, accurate artillery, and effective direct communication, this was difficult to do. Shell craters, barbed wire, and other obstacles could slow down the advancing infantry, causing them to fall out of sync with the barrage. Artillery units needed constant updates from runners and telephone operators to adjust their fire, and any breakdown in communication could prove disastrous. Additionally, often unreliable ammunition could cause short shots where a shell would fall short and hit friendly infantry, even when everything was calculated correctly. However, it was an effective strategy in many battles, but also had many complete fiascos where casualties from friendly fire were substantial. Besides the creeping barrage, there were other artillery fire techniques such as counter-battery fire, where artillery batteries would literally engage in duels with each other, trying to locate and place shells onto their positions. They used sound ranging, aerial observation, and artillery observers to locate and neutralize them. Artillery crews would keep firing relentlessly despite being under fire by enemy artillery, both trying to destroy each other. Also, when not actively engaging in combat, artillery was used to harass the enemy. Harassing fire was aimed at disrupting the enemy's rest, resupply, and morale. Irregular and unpredictable bombardments kept enemy troops on edge, preventing them from relaxing or effectively organizing their defenses. When attacks across no man's land failed, someone thought of digging a tunnel under it to reach the enemy. This led to a new dimension of the battlefield, underground, where both sides tried to dig tunnels toward each other, plant huge mines under enemy trenches and detonate them, or allow infantry to get closer to the trenches for a more effective attack. It sometimes happened that they would break into each other's tunnels, leading to underground fights to the death in dark, narrow tunnels using pickaxes and shovels. They even had shortened rifles to be used in the tunnel if they met the enemy. The job of digging tunnels was extremely risky and dangerous, and many tunnelers were buried alive in cave-ins and collapses. There was a great danger of flooding or the accumulation of toxic gases from artillery fired above. It was so risky that tunnelers carried canaries in cages, which would show signs of poisoning first and signal that the tunnel must be evacuated immediately. Digging was done under horrific conditions, in the utmost silence to avoid detection by the enemy who was always listening. It was cold, and they often worked in knee-deep, freezing water with only a single candle for light. The British, using their pre-war mining experience, perfected this technique by digging in the clay layer of the soil, planting and detonating tons of explosives under enemy positions, completely destroying them, turning the tide of many key battles such as the Battle of Messines, where 19 out of 22 mines were detonated with around 1 million pounds of explosives, creating the largest non-nuclear explosion in history. This tactic was so effective that both sides developed various ways to detect and counter enemy mining efforts, such as digging a tunnel towards and under enemy tunnelers and placing explosives to collapse their tunnel, etc. Besides these tactics, many brutal psychological games occurred in the trenches. For example, dead soldiers were often used to destroy enemy morale by leaving them in strange and bizarre positions, or using their remains or parts of their skeletons as messages or signposts. Sometimes they would remain entangled in barbed wire for days for their comrades to helplessly watch. They were also often used as booby traps, ready to activate explosives or other traps if moved. In addition to that, different staged and fake actions were happening, such as fake surrender or fake retreats, only to lure the enemy into a trap or counterattack. It is truly fascinating how far human creativity can go in order to destroy his enemies.